Welcome, everyone. My name is Melissa Lujan with the National Center on Substance Abuse and Child Welfare. Today's presentation is available at cff.org under their webinar section. We want to thank you for joining our second webinar of our post-conference web series. Today's webinar is entitled Interventions for Adolescents in the Child Welfare System Who Are Court Involved by Randy Muck. Randy is a senior clinical consultant for Advocates for Youth and Family Behavioral Health Treatment. Mr. Muck served as the chief of the Targeted Populations Branch at SAMHSA's Center for Substance Abuse Treatment until March of 2011. After 33 years of federal service, he retired and joined Advocates for Youth and Family Behavioral Health Treatment as a consultant for youth and family treatment. His publications on substance abuse treatment systems and adolescent treatment have appeared in numerous peer-reviewed journals and books. He earned his bachelor's in psychology and his master's in education in counseling with a focus on family therapy from Boston University. Welcome, Randy.
Welcome, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone, whichever it might be. This is a topic that's very important to me and was for my entire career at SAMHSA because I had all the child and family programs in the branch that I ran. So I have stuck with doing this kind of work as an independent consultant after leaving the government and have found it quite rewarding this way and actually a lot more fun. So I'm having a good time with this, and I hope as we go through this that I will be able to offer you at least some new information. You may have questions, as was mentioned. You can please bring those up as we go along, but there will be time at the end to answer them. And also, if you think of questions after the webinar is completed, I know sometimes something will come to me that I've totally forgotten to ask about, and I go, oh my goodness, I should have really asked that question. You're welcome to reach out to me. At the end, you'll have my contact information. But either way you go, whether through Child or Family Futures or to me, just be aware that I'll be letting them know what your questions might be and what answers I might want to give back. So back in, it was about 2006, we got 2005 data because I was very curious about youth in foster care because in our main data set at SAMHSA, and some of you probably will be quite aware of this and some of you may not know anything about it, but since 1997, all of our adolescent-focused programs have been using the same assessment tool and the same follow-up instruments at the same follow-up points. So we now have a data set of well over 27,000 youth who've been through either substance abuse treatment or treatment for substance abuse and co-occurring mental health disorders. And we were seeing that there were large numbers of youth who were involved in the foster care system, actually more than we expected we would. But if you look at the distribution here, it's changed a little bit since 2005, not dramatically. You'll see something that's probably familiar to most of you, that, of course, youth get involved in the foster care system at a much higher rate when they're younger. But the thing that really stood out to us is the spike that comes in basically a bimodal distribution of youth when they turn about 13, 14, and how high that goes. And that's typically not youth being abused by their parents necessarily, but it's indicative of family problems and other things going on in the home. And often it's indicative of substance abuse problems also. Many of these youth are also involved in the court system as well as the foster care system. And there's a lot of work going on right now, I know, on crossover youth, some of which I'm involved with. I won't go a lot into that today, but I'm aware of that, and I think it's extremely important work because for adolescents, they can typically end up in both of these systems, and they tend not to do a very good job in most places of talking with each other or even speaking the same language sometimes. So we took a look at the data we had. Now, this is somewhat imperfect because the questions are asked in slightly different ways. We looked at our CSAT data set and found that 8.3% of all the youth that we saw in treatment, when we saw them, were currently in the foster care system. The only way we had to compare that was through the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And in 2005, it showed, and that's where the question is different, because they ask, have you ever been in foster care? We asked that too, but we also asked, are you currently in foster care? But NSDUH only asked, have you ever been in? And of the youth 12 to 17 years old, in that sample, only 0.6% had ever been in foster care. So the odds ratio is like you have a 15-to-1 greater chance of being in substance abuse treatment if you're in foster care. But that's an underestimate because of the way the NSDUH data count it. But that's a very high number. And the other thing we know is from our data is that the driving force behind referrals to substance abuse treatment for adolescents is the juvenile justice system. It had gotten up to close to 60%. It's shrunk now down to about 50%, but it still remains the biggest portion of any type of referral base that sends youth into substance abuse treatment. And I would also say that it's important to note that if you're not with the substance abuse treatment field and you haven't kept up with some of the changes happening, many of them are switching to using evidence-based practices, which we'll talk about in a bit, that also focus on co-occurring mental health disorders, and there's some very good reasons for that. So in looking, and taking a switch, not looking at the foster care system necessarily, but looking at the data set and the past year violence and crime that youth have been involved with, you see the top number there, any violence or illegal activity, 82%. And notice at the bottom, when we're talking about illegal activity, we don't count possession or use. So if a youth is picked up because they're in possession of a substance or because they're using a substance, they're not in this data set. That to us did not count as illegal activity the way we wanted to display it and also understand it. We were interested in those youth who are actually involved in drug use and other types of crimes that are quite important to society, including the physical violence, illegal activities, property crimes. You see the rest listed there. Severity turns out to be a really important indicator of how well youth may do in treatment, how well they'll do when treatment's over, and also in what type of treatment setting they should be seen. So we have what we call the general victimization scale, and you can think of that as a proxy for trauma that youth have experienced or are experiencing in their lives. And the lower group are ones who have had past low-level trauma. The high group typically are youth who are currently experiencing trauma. So those with high lifetime levels of victimization have 117 times higher odds of having 5 or more major problems when they present to treatment. So this becomes a real issue for treatment programs, whether they be mental health or substance abuse, because you're not dealing with one issue. You're dealing with many different types of issues, and we're looking here at the co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. So this GBS scale predicts a couple of things. It predicts that youth who are more high in terms of victimization, more likely to be being victimized currently with more violent types of victimization, also exhibit a greater readiness to change when they present to treatment. So that's really good news, because if you can figure out where they are in terms of how much trauma they currently are experiencing, you can find youth and kind of separate them as into those who are kind of low in their readiness, which would indicate they might be a candidate for some motivational interviewing very early on. If they're very high, it indicates they're ready to change right now. And that's a good thing, but you also have to pay attention to where it is you place them in treatment to be able to facilitate change for them. The other difficulty is that that high-risk group has the highest relapse risk. And you can see the things that really relate to relapse are regular alcohol or drug use in the home, at school among their peers, or with their social groups. Looking at those two variables, we can explain almost all the variants in terms of whether you actually return to use after treatment or not. So here we took a look at one particular program that sees quite a few youth in Illinois. And we took those who were on the left in an outpatient program, and you'll see that the solid green bar or line are those who had a lower or moderate rating on victimization, and the dotted line are those who had a higher. I'm sorry, I've just turned that backwards. The green line that's solid are those that have the high, and the dotted lines are those that are low or moderate. So what you see there, if you look at those, is those highly traumatized groups, if they were placed in outpatient, actually didn't get better. They stayed the same. However, the low to moderate youth, in terms of victimization, actually got better over time at the same kinds of rates that we saw for youth who were not being victimized. However, if you place those youth with high victimization into a residential setting, a more secure environment, they improved at the same rate as other youth who were moderate or low on the victimization scale, which actually just makes sense because one of the things you would think is if they're at high risk, then we want to remove them from that situation where they're at risk, and putting them in a residential program makes a lot of sense because it can move them somewhere where they can focus on the treatment process. If you think about a youth who goes into a 1.5-hour group session in an outpatient setting once a week or twice a week, the odds that they're going to be able to get their minds wrapped around making changes in their substance use and around some of the co-occurring mental health disorders they have are pretty low because they're going to be more worried about what's going to happen after they leave the treatment setting. So if they're removed to residential, they have the safe and secure environment where they can actually focus on their own issues that they have as well as victimization. And we see then that the rates of change the slopes are pretty much the same for other youth. So here's one way that you can actually use residential treatment for a very good purpose. Typically, or I should say historically, in adolescent treatment, residential was really a treatment of choice, and many youth went to residential programs. In the last 10 years or so, a lot of residential programs have closed, particularly those that are funded by state, county, federal dollars, and the residential treatment system is mostly made up now of very private programs that are very, very costly for families to get their youth into. So there is a place for residential treatment, and this is one of those factors that would tell us that youth need it. But what happened, I think, was that it was just think as much by child welfare, but it's reading a lot for many youth who really didn't need it. And one thing we also know now, from the I have a slide to show you on that, is that if you give youth a higher level of treatment than they need, they tend to get worse or don't improve, one of the two. So you really need to target the treatment at the needs cluster that they present with. And this is one of those needs in that cluster that ranks pretty high on why you would want to use residential treatment. So if you were ever in a policy discussion and talking about the need for residential treatment, this is something you can use to point out to policymakers. Well, we may not need as much as we have, but there certainly is a need for residential treatment. The other thing is that multiple clinical problems are the norm, not just with high victimization, but with most youth who come into substance abuse treatment, whether it be just for substance abuse, whether that's all that's been identified. What we tend to find is most of them in our data set between 70 and 80%, according to the study, have at least one co-occurring mental health problem or disorder. So that behooves you, well, us as a field, to be paying attention to co-occurring disorders in youth, which, certainly is being done a lot more recently, but still not enough attention is paid to this. And I think it cuts both ways. What I see happening is that in substance abuse treatment programs, they have a difficult time figuring out how to work with the co-occurring disorders. In mental health treatment programs, they tend to have a difficult time or kind of ignore what happens with the substance abuse and focus on the mental health. What we do know is that treating both together is the best, but we also know that if you treat only one, meaning you treat a mental health disorder or a couple of disorders, and don't treat the substance abuse problem, the substance abuse problem will not go away. You can help them with the depression. You can help them with their trauma and anxiety problems. That may be successful, but you will not see a lessening in their substance use patterns over time and the problems associated with that. Conversely, if you focus on the substance use, you can bring that level of use down and the problems associated with it, but you're not really going to touch much on any of the other mental health issues that you come in with. So what this really says to us, I think, is that it's extremely important on the front end that youth get an assessment or at least a screening tool that does a good job of identifying what disorders and issues are there that need to be dealt with so they can be placed in the appropriate program. And this remains a large problem in the field. When I talk with, for instance, juvenile court judges, and I ask them, what can you tell me about the treatment where you refer your youth? Well, they can't tell me much of anything because they don't know what's happening in the treatment program. I don't know how it is so much on the Child Protective Services side, but the few times that I've spoken with people there, they maybe have a little better idea on the mental health side, but they don't have a clear idea of the organization and treatment as it would relate to co-occurring disorders for youth that are referred. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is in many places there becomes this inertia where someone has liked a particular program for a very long time, maybe for some very good reasons in the past. That program hasn't changed. It's not now a program that can address this mix of problems and issues that youth come in with. However, the system continues to refer youth to the same programs over and over. One of the things that I like to train judges on, and I have done this with Child Protective Services also, is how to be a good consumer of services. If the child welfare system and those crossover youth involved in juvenile justice make up the majority of the youth who are being seen for treatment, and they are the primary payer for services, they then have a chance to have a huge impact up front in terms of youth and their families getting to the right services. So if whoever is referring them is not a good consumer of treatment services, your outcomes are not going to be anywhere near as good as they could be, or but they should be now, given that we have had the development of numerous evidence-based practices over the last 12 or 13 years. I will say back in 1997, we looked at the extant literature and found only 17 journal articles in existence that actually had been published in peer-reviewed journals that focused on adolescent substance abuse treatment. So, not coincidentally, what was happening was substance abuse treatment programs were overlaying adult models of treatment on youth, and what we know from that data, looking at it, is those youth who were either treated with an adult model or were treated together with adults either did not change or got worse during their treatment. So extremely important to try and figure out as much you can, as best you can, what issues your youth have prior to them coming into a treatment program and making a correct placement from the beginning. You'll also find, I suspect, that even if you've got programs that are doing a separate assessment when you show up, that if they have money attached to them, they don't usually get referred somewhere else because they say, the program says, oh, this is not a youth that we do well with. They're not paying attention to that. Someone has to force them to do that. So maybe a subtitle of this presentation should also be being a good consumer of services, which then relates to how well the treatment works for your youth and your families. Now, I highlight the Gain Short screener only because we used it in SAMHSA for our programs. And you can see that you can adjust the cut points on this. If you have a higher cut point, you'll increase the prevalence. You'll find more of those who have a problem. But you'll reduce the sensitivity, meaning that you might catch or put into a treatment program more youth who don't have that difficulty or that problem. But if you use a cut point of 3 or more symptoms, and I should mention this is a 20-item screener that takes about 5 minutes, that has 5 questions on substance use, 5 on internalizing mental health disorders, 5 on externalizing mental health disorders, and 5 on criminogenic risk. If you take that and they score at 3 or higher in any of those 4 domains, you are going to find 99% of the youth who have those problems with 91% sensitivity, meaning you're picking up the right ones, and 89% specificity. So this is a screener that actually does as well as or better than anything else that's out there currently. I also bring it up because of 2 other reasons. One is there's free training available in doing this. You can go to www.chestnut, C-H-E-S-T-N-U-T, like the tree, chestnut.org, and find information about this. You can download this short screener. You can ask for and get training, either online or in person. And the cost is only basically a cost for reproduction and keeping this stuff running up on the website, which is $100 for people to use it throughout their organization for an entire year. So you won't find any screener that's any cheaper than that either. Actually, there's no money being made on it. So I think of it more as being in the public domain because you could actually go online and pull it down yourself and get the information and provide your own training internally. So one of the questions we finally asked ourselves as we were developing this data set and trying to move beyond the 17 journal articles that existed, and that was from 1936 to 1997, which approaches addressed best co-occurring mental health and trauma issues. So we know what every youth in that data set has received in terms of the treatment program, and we did our first cut and looked at the ones that actually seemed to do the best based on our analyses. And you see the list there. You might know some of these. You may not know some of these. You can find them pretty easily just by doing Google and typing them in. Many of these, the manuals for them are also available for free at that same Chestnut website. So the 3 things we were looking at were the emotional problem scale, days of victimization, and days of traumatic memories. And I'll show you the outcome here. This is a pre-post effect size for the emotional problems by type of treatment. Those are the ones listed there that did the best. And you can see which ones turned out the best. 7 challenges, which you may or may not have heard of. CHS, which is the Chestnut Health Systems approach. ACRA, which is the Adolescent Community Reinforcement approach. and coming in fourth was MST, or multi-systemic therapy. Now, one thing about these four approaches is they vary widely in cost. MST, in the first year to become operational, will cost the typical program somewhere around or in excess of $100,000. The other thing with MST, and what we looked at SAMHSA in terms of programs we wanted to fund, was, is there an ability for sustainability? The higher the cost, the less likely that would be the case, but also if it does not allow for a train-the-trainers approach, so that a program can eventually become self-sufficient and train their own staff in the intervention over time, that makes it less sustainable also. The next one there, ACRA, you see CYT/AAFT. Those acronyms have to do with what it was called in the initial study and the program it's being funded under currently at CSAT. Right now it's being replicated in 72 sites. That program would cost you about $27,000 in the first year. So quite a difference, and it also allows for train-the-trainers. The third one, the CHS treatment program, is a bit less expensive, but there's not a huge training system set up behind that one. So if you were looking at getting something where you had trainers readily available to come out and train people in programs, they would not have that there as easily and as quickly as these other three of the four that are listed. And finally, the last one, 7 Challenges, is specifically a co-occurring program. So you see it does well with the emotional problems, and it would cost about $16,000 in the first year and go down from there. So this gives you just a snapshot of what we found around the co-occurring disorders and the trauma, but I found that this has been helpful just to spur the thinking of people who are purchasers of services as to what they might want to choose as an evidence-based practice, and making cost an important piece of that, and also the ability to continue to train. So an evidence-based practice is one that's tested with good outcomes. There's a manual, so it could be replicated and trained. There's a training program. That's why the CHS program doesn't have as much behind it. There's supervision leading to certification in the evidence-based practice. Beyond that, there's ongoing monitoring after that occurs. And then finally, there's outcomes measurement that happens. And if there weren't, we wouldn't be able to have those data. I mentioned we were doing well, I'm saying we, I'm still not part of SAMHSA and CSAT at this point, but we started there a replication of ACRA coupled with the Assertive Continuing Care in 72 sites. Prior to that, we did a 36-site replication on MET-CBT5, which is a 5-session intervention, 2 sessions of motivational enhancement therapy, which is pretty much the same as MI, and 3 group sessions of CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. What you have right there are the sites where all the interventions we tested in 1997 were done, to include MET-CBT5 and ACRA. And there with the diamonds you see EAT. That's the acronym, stands for Effective Adolescent Treatment. So in those 36 sites. So the question was, for me and many of us, could you take something that was done in an experimental design and actually move it to the field and have decent outcomes? And we didn't know that because we were moving this out there with very minimal control over what happens compared to an experimental design. There was myself at SAMHSA. There were 5 trainers who reported to me. There were the people who trained on the GAIN, the assessment instrument we used. I got reports every monthly of how they were doing, what was going on. But, you know, that's clearly not the same as having an experiment happening and people who involved in the experiment standing over the shoulders of the clinicians throughout the entire thing. We did, though, make sure they were audio taping and sent those audio tapes in. They did get rated in the same way as they did in the experimental design, and they also had to achieve certification. So my hope was that we would be able to take something that we had done in the laboratory and actually move it out to the field, which is really how things are supposed to be designed, which is the NIH, the institutes there like NIDA or NIAAA, would do the basic research to establish efficacy, and then it should be transferred to SAMHSA to fund in the field to look at effectiveness. That doesn't often happen, and this was the first time there was a large-scale replication that actually did that. So I was a bit in fear and trepidation of how this might come out, given we were doing it for the first time, and not everybody was too terribly excited about us being responsible for doing the training and then ultimately the outcomes. However, I was quite surprised. Now I'm going to show you this to the non-statisticians just so the next slide makes sense to you. So this is a Tukey box plot. That star in the middle is the median, so half scored above it and half below it. Let me also say on the right side what we're measuring is effect size. So we're not looking at p-values. Is there a difference statistically? There already was. We knew that. What we wanted to determine was how big was the effect. And, of course, the higher you go, the better off you are. Second is everything in yellow is the middle 50%. So the middle 50% of the youth will be shown in yellow. And then finally, the red is the range from the very worst to the very best in terms of individuals within a program. These data were aggregated across both these programs and compared in this way between the experimental design and moving it to the field in the effective adolescent treatment. So here's what we found. As I said, much to my surprise, the replication sites did better on average than the experimental sites. You see the median's higher. The middle 50% is bunched tighter, and it's higher. And you see that the range is about the same at the low end, but many of the programs, I think I mentioned it here, well, 75% were above the CYT median, and 6 programs were completely above any outcomes from CYT. So I had to ask myself and others, why in the world did we get that kind of outcome? Because that's not what people are used to seeing. And here we strayed from the convention that normally exists, and instead of saying you must adhere very strictly to the protocol and have absolute fidelity to the model, we did say that until the counselors and the supervisors became certified. Once that happened, knowing what happens in the real world, we know that programs modify things. So they were given the opportunity to present to us a suggested modification for their own circumstances, which we would consider and see if it made clinical sense, and if it did, we would approve it and let them do that. And I think that's really what led into the better results that we got, and some that were even a lot higher. The 2 major things that they did, well, 3 actually. One was many were rural sites, and they had a hard time getting enough youth for a group, so they wanted to do CBT individually, which we allowed. The second was that almost all of them added some continuing care after this was over. And the third one was that almost all of them added some kind of family piece to this program. MET CBT 5 on its own does not involve the family, it only involves the youth. So those are 3 things that happened in terms of how they changed the program, modified it slightly, and probably led to the better outcomes we saw there. So that was encouraging enough to me that we went on to do these now 72-site replication, which is still underway, but showing some very good outcomes. So it does show that with some careful consideration, and if you have the right developer and the right program where they'll allow this, you can make modifications to an EVP and actually not harm the outcomes if they do make clinical sense, and you have people willing to allow you to do that and let you do that. I put this up here. This is the 7 Challenges program, just to let you know how, and if I put any of these EVPs up here, you would see something similar. They're just growing like wildfire all over the country. There are places where 7 Challenges is not represented, and you'll find that also with the other EVPs. But they're growing rapidly, and they're growing rapidly because, frankly, states are requiring and federal grants are requiring that programs use an evidence-based practice. So because of that, people are picking them up. So therefore, as people are picking them up, I think Child Protective Services and the courts need to do a very good job, again, of being good consumers and matching up their youth with the evidence-based program that actually does the best for how their youth present the treatment. Now, someone might ask a question when we get to the end, well, how do I know which is the best one for my youth? Currently, there are over 20 treatment briefs being written under a grant that was given from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention that will outline each of these programs in a way that's accessible to judges, to CPS workers, so it won't be in jargon, it won't be overwhelming in statistics, although they'll be behind it, but it will be written in plain language that will help you determine which program will work best for your youth. I expect those probably to be published in the fall. So stay tuned, and hopefully those will soon be available. One other thing I looked at is from the GPRA data, the Government Performance and Results Act. So we had those 2 programs where we were mandating the use of a particular assessment instrument, and we were also mandating the intervention. That's the METCP5 and ACRA-ACC. Then we also had programs that targeted youth, and they were told they had to use an ABP. However, we were not monitoring it in the way we were those 2. We just trusted the program to go out and get the training and do their own monitoring and be working with the developers. Same thing with C-Youth. There were programs that had youth in their programs, also had adults. It was a mix. So I looked at this abstinence at 6 months. So what was the change or what was the improvement in abstinence at 6 months? And you can see it's a huge difference when we both mandated the instrument and the intervention, but I don't think it was the mandating of the instrument and the intervention. It was the ongoing monitoring and supervision we knew they were getting in the intervention and in the assessment that actually drives those rates to be so much higher. So the staff does much better when someone is actually paying attention to their work, which makes just a lot of practical sense, but also is a question that judges and Child Protective Services should be asking about is how are the outcomes being monitored in the program where I'm sending my youth? Because if they're not monitoring well, or they're not actually following through and getting certified as they should, you could see this, 12.6 compared to almost 70% difference in abstinence, just looking at that one measure. And it's very similar for the other measures we've looked at. Now I'm going to switch for a bit. This is a little bit of a different way of looking at choosing programs. Drug Strategies back in the early 2000s was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to come up with something that would be accessible to the public. The idea was for parents to tell them what to look for in a good treatment program. They put together an expert panel, and the panel got all the data that were available at the time and came up with 9 elements that needed to be there. These are the basic things to have an effective treatment for youth. And those followed there. They do a good assessment. They do matching. It's an integrated program with co-occurring mental health disorders being paid attention to, as well as substance use disorders. Family was involved. It was developmentally appropriate. They did something to engage and retain the youth and families. The staff had good qualifications. They paid attention to gender and cultural issues. They did some kind of continuing care after treatment was over, and they measured their outcomes. Those are very, very basic things that you would hope any program is doing. Well, I shouldn't say we there, after we finished this with the expert panel, Drug Strategies went out and did a survey and had every single state agency and at least 50 professional organizations, such as the AMA, tell them if they had their own youth or the youth of a friend who needed substance abuse treatment, what were the 1 or 2 best programs in the country where they would send them. So they gathered all this information, and you can imagine there were, a broad range of types of programs mentioned, anywhere from ones that were $30,000 a month to a couple of states that said, we don't think we have any good programs here. And of those programs, there were 144 because there was some overlap. But when they went out and looked at them, actually the majority of them didn't get a passing score on any one of those 9 elements. Actually, none of them did. Typically, they got a passing score on 1. And you can go to the Drug Strategies site and actually look at how this was done, and that's drugstrategies.com. If you put in org, you're going to get a totally different stuff. Drug Strategies, one word, .com, and go reading pamphlet, whatever you want to call it, is still available. Unfortunately, the free copies have all been given away, so I think they charge whatever their cost is. I know it's below $20. But I always recommend for anyone in Child Protective Services or working in the court, particularly the judges, that they get a hold of a copy of this and they read it, because what it will do is tell them what things to look for, because they want to be good consumers of care. And then secondly, it gives them specific questions they should ask around each of these, and also tells them what kind of answers they should hear that would tell them that this program actually knows what it's doing. So this is being used pretty widely, even though it's a little bit dated, but the information, there's more research, but it certainly doesn't cancel out anything that's in here. So I think it's an excellent tool. It's not one you have to buy, 50 copies for your agency. You need one, and that would take care of it. And will give you or whoever is the consumer services the information they need to go out and talk with programs. Because right now I think most people don't do that because they don't know what to ask, frankly. And they get kind of snowed by programs. And I'm saying this as myself a clinician and doing clinical work for 16 years. Whenever I went to a program, I would ask to talk to some of the youth. They would always trot out, the 2 best youth in the entire program, and they would tell me how great it was done and how wonderful they had grasp on what interprets they can help the caregivers there and the treatment providers, and sit down with you and talk and get a different story. So important to talk to the youth, because you can actually get a good level of insight about what the youth have to say about treatment if you can get them alone and they're not being coached to basically sell the program. I've done a number of focus groups around the country with youth. They say several things in every focus group I've been in. One of them is, why don't you make sure that these programs hire people who like kids? And that makes sense, and the youth are picking up on it, that there are a lot of providers out there who actually don't like working in juvenile settings. Unfortunately, they're there. It's a job for them, but it's important that they do like the youth. Another thing is youth feel like they've been left out in the cold when they finish a treatment program because no one follows up with them and they have no one to call and the counselors are so busy. So support services following treatment are crucial. I think you'll find in the Medicaid expansion, should that go forward, that there will be supportive services for youth that will actually be paid for, that some are quite novel and can reach a lot of youth for a very low cost and will help any program, be it mental health or substance abuse, or a combined co-occurring disorders clinic to provide supportive services after youth leave. So there is this. Some people thought it was a little too high in terms of where it was aimed, that maybe something a bit simpler should be written for parents. So the Partnership for Drug-Free America has written another guide, and that guide is at a somewhat lower level in terms of the language it uses, but does a good job of educating parents, and might be one that you want to look at in Child Protective Services to give parents so they understand what treatment should be like, and they can become your allies in terms of what's happening, or to the foster families so they know what treatment should be like and what they should be expecting. You see also there are online resources, so that's another reason to go to the Drug Strategy site, because you get a whole compendium of the research to date when it was written. There's a special section on juvenile justice and also another special section on screening and assessment, and then online program descriptions of those 144 programs, none of which did much better than getting a passing score on one of the 9 elements, which was really a travesty at this point in our development. So, treatment has a long way to go. But there are programs that were using this to inform themselves and their providers within their treatment program and working with their communities. And so I just encourage anyone working in child welfare or in the courts to get involved with the treatment programs. And if they haven't seen this, show it to them and put pressure on these treatment programs to actually provide the quality of care that our youth and our families deserve. Now, when we take a shift here and look at the juvenile justice side of things, most programs have small effects, but they're not negligible. This came from 2 meta-analyses that Mark Lipsey did that shows a reduction of recidivism from 0.5 to 0.46. That's minuscule. But above that median, most programs reduce recidivism by 10% or more, and a quarter of the studies show recidivism reductions of 30% or more. So some things do work. A lot of people say nothing works. Some things do work, but you have to, again, find the right treatment program to do that. He actually has just finished a meta-analysis on treatment outcomes, which should be published, I would say, within the next 3 to 6 months. But it's being used right now in the healthcare reform effort to inform what's being written for both Medicaid expansion and whatever else happens in healthcare reform about what should be involved in treatment and what kind of programs actually you should be referred to. I'm not going to go through this whole list, but this gives you just the average or better best types of programs and what things they provide at the levels of pre-adjudication, probation, and institutionalization. Okay, some programs have negative effects or no effects, and you can see the list there whenever it comes back up again, like Scared Straight and boot camps. The other thing I would mention is this last bullet, the problem of iatrogenic effects. A lot of people were worried about youth. The work of Deshawn in Oregon that showed that youth who were lower in severity or didn't have a problem, who were placed in groups with youth who had higher severity or larger problems, tended to drag those youth into more problematic behavior than the other way around. That has been studied several more times after that, also in a meta-analysis. And what's been found is that that is true for universal prevention programs. It is not true for treatment programs. So there's no reason that youth cannot be treated in groups if they're done well. Here are 4 major predictors of getting a bigger effect and how you might get them. And this relates to the next slide of programs that used 1 or more of these. And you can see the importance here in reduction of recidivism and the percentage from the 0.5 control group rate. Remember, in general, if you took the median, they went from 0.5 to 0.46, which was a negligible change. So If they employed all 4, which is group 1, that was the best. Group 2 would have 3. Group 3 would have 2. Group 4 would have 1. So you think, well, gee, I want to choose the very best program. Well, you may want to rethink that, because the effect of a well-implemented weak program is as big as a strong program implemented poorly. So you don't want to buy a program or refer to a program where the therapists actually are not trained well enough and the implementation is not done well enough to actually get the effects that the program has shown in the literature. So the best thing to do is have a strong program implemented well, but beyond that, what counsel I give to people is choose the program you can implement the best based on cost, based on the training your therapists need, and that's a message that needs to get out to treatment programs also. But it's also something to ask when you look at a treatment program, if they're doing something that's a family systems theory-based intervention, do they have therapists who are actually trained in that and meet the minimum qualifications, typically of a master's level degree? Because if they don't, then you're likely not to get as good of outcomes if you chose a program that wasn't as strong particularly, but that program could implement well. So adolescents are entering more intensive levels of care and typically have higher severity. We know there are multiple problems, child maltreatment, and the multiple problems are the norm, and they're closely related to each other. There are a number of standardized assessment tools, treatment protocols, and other resources available that support evidence-based practice. So important to be doing a good screening, a good assessment, and choosing an evidence-based practice that actually can work and that the person purchasing the services knows what's there, and they can be a good consumer of purchasing the correct program or the one that's most likely correct or closest to being correct for the youth they have. An evidence-based practice should achieve reliable outcomes, should have a good protocol delivery, and they should have good ongoing performance monitoring. That's where a lot of programs fall down. You always want to make sure they're continuing to monitor constantly so that they can make changes if they need to in how their program is structured as they're learning things. When we started with that data set, we had no idea how high the numbers were for traumatic victimization in that high category. That made a number of changes in many of the treatment protocols that followed after that once we had found that data. And the other thing was we didn't realize the huge numbers of youth involved in foster care, which then led to some development of evidence-based practices that really help youth who are in foster care and have substance abuse problems. Again, the gain, that's one measure that I showed up there. That is not the only measure. CSAT has been using it because it was the only one around that was not proprietary at the time when we started. So we're gathering data that's similar in a way that we can compare programs and outcomes. That doesn't mean you can't choose another instrument that you may like more. Two come to mind, the CASI-A by Kathy Myers with the Treatment Research Institute. The second one being the Teen ASI, recently finished by Yifra Kaminer at Yale. There is also training now available, will be available soon, through that same grant where the treatment briefs are being written through the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. They should be advertising that sometime after February when they meet to start this grant. And so there will be treatment for juvenile drug courts and more broadly for juvenile courts that can go more in depth into these things and also to help do assessments of courts and treatment programs and how to match them up better and, you know, help the courts become better consumers, but help the programs get better also. These new evidence-based practices are more standardized, of course. They've got the specific assessments that draw out things that most assessments don't if they're homegrown or if they're some of the older ones with not very good validity or reliability. which is readiness for change, which is quite important. What's the recovery environment like? Because again, as I mentioned before, the recovery environment is crucial and explains most of the variance of who returns to use, which is the relapse potential, psychopathology, crime, violence, and particularly HIV, but STD risks. Youth are pretty high in terms of number of sexual partners and having unprotected sex while using drugs or alcohol, and many programs don't do much in that arena. If I were to add something to those 9 elements, it would be around that. Let someone check and make sure that that actually is happening in the treatment program. So some issues to consider. Juvenile justice, because they're outsized in their presence in the treatment system, is kind of like the gorilla in the room. If you can use your juvenile justice system, if you can use your judge, if you are a judge, if you can get involved or get someone in your court involved who can take, for instance, treating teens and go out and look at the programs to which you are referring youth, you're going to find out a lot of things, and you may find that you need to use your purchasing power to either make a change in the program or a change in your referral pattern. There are the crossover youth. They're particularly at risk, and the one thing I would say we know for them is doing a very good screening and then a good assessment are crucial. If that's not done early on, there's relatively little hope for these youth because they typically do not get to the right programs. In support for funding, well, it's increasingly relying on demonstrating effectiveness. That's one piece, although that doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to continue to have support, but it is one way to try and keep that support when policymakers are making decisions on where to ration treatment or where to cut back treatment and what types of treatment to cut back. In California currently, for instance, Jerry Brown's latest proposal in his budget is to close what was the California Youth Authority. I forget what it's called now, but it was basically residential, lock up the kids, send them away from where they live, and provide them, I'm not really sure what services. There were a very huge lack of services, but it was a huge cost, and that cost will go back, that money is going to be going to return to counties and offer some counties more funds where they can do better treatment closer to home. New York City right now is engaged in the exact same thing because they have been sending all their youth upstate for their treatment, which was typically residential and lasted for a long time, and for the most part it was placement in a program that wasn't one that was appropriate for the youth. So the treatment needs of the youth that we see, we have to incorporate appropriate and effective interventions for these needs. So there are clusters of needs we've found for youth. It's too difficult to get into in this presentation, but if anyone's interested, I could send you some information on that about how youth tend to cluster around 7 different areas in terms of what their need cluster is. And that pretty much explains through factor analysis almost all of the youth that do come into treatment, because there are subtypes in terms of what their needs are. Continuing care is as or more important than the treatment delivered. That may seem like a rash statement, but consider the fact that the average youth that goes into a residential treatment program for substance abuse will be using again within 1 month of their release if no continuing care is involved. There's a protocol called assertive continuing care. You can find that at the Chestnut site too. The reason I keep mentioning Chestnut was because I didn't want to have my own website at SAMHSA because it would take sometimes 2 years to get something posted. So it was a proxy site I used to put all of our information there. That manual's free. You can download it, and the research also is there that is available, and you can look at the huge changes that continuing care makes. And then finally, ongoing support services. I separate this from continuing care. As healthcare reform moves forward, how this is being looked at is that the continuing care is an ongoing piece of treatment. So those are treatment dollars. We separated out support services as a promising practice because there are not a lot of data behind it. But it could include things people tend to think of AA or 12-step groups. The problem is most youth do not go to AA or 12-step groups. The few who do show better outcomes, but getting them there is difficult, and finding an appropriate AA group or NA group or self-help group is very, very difficult. So there are other support services that are coming available, some of them being text messaging to youth as supports. And it's not a counselor sitting there having to text each youth. Many of them are automated messages that are set up for the youth, and they have a way to get back in contact with the program should they need to. It could be done at a very low cost. So that's one of those promising practices. So at this point, I'm about, I think, maybe 5 minutes short of the 15 minutes we said we'd leave for questions. But I will stop here. That's how you can reach me, either through that phone number or that email address. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to send them to me. If you want some materials, for instance, you want the article that was written on the 9 elements of effective treatment, that's available. I have electronically. I can send it to you. If you have further questions, I'd be glad to answer those. With the one caveat that I will also be copying back to Child and Family Futures what it is that I'm saying to you and the kind of things that I'm sending to you in the field, so they're at least aware of what's happening. So with that, I thank you for your time today and would open it up to any questions. While you may be submitting a question, I just recall something I also wanted to say around a support service. There is a group called Rational Recovery based on the principles of RBT. They're not anti-12-step, but they are a different approach, and it can be done over the web with youth as well as groups that actually do meet in communities around the country, and it's listed there. You can just Google Rational Recovery, and that is another support service available that most programs aren't aware of and don't refer youth to. They tend to stay more engaged in that program.
Randy, this is Melissa over at Children and Family Futures. You did briefly mention the 72 set of replications that are currently going on now. Can you tell us a little more about how long that's going to run through and who's actually implementing that?
Yeah, it's all community-based programs who applied for a grant to implement it. It's all over the country. I wish I could rattle off all 72 sites to you, but I can't. But it was done in 4 cohorts. The last cohort is going to finish next year. So once that's done, I would expect information from that to be made available through journals and other things. But there are presentations currently happening about that intervention and about how it works. And there's also training going on for anybody else, too. So there are people who are availing themselves of training in ACRA, and that's being done in 72 sites, who have nothing to do with the grant program and the replication. There are programs that are getting training in MET CBT5 who had nothing to do with any of the grant programs. There are programs getting trained in 7 challenges all over the country at this point, which actually has never been funded by the government directly in a replication, but showed, as we saw there, very positive outcomes. If you would want to reach any of the developers of any of those programs or others, I can certainly be a resource for that. Having been in the field as long as I have, in the adolescent treatment field being a very small field compared to others, I do know most of the developers personally and the programs that they're training on, and can get you in touch with them easily if you need any assistance, and can help answer questions if you have any before you want to talk to them.
And Randy, we do have one more question that came in. It is, when you state that services will be provided through drug court for teens, will this be provided nationwide?
Would that question relate to what the grant that's providing services that I mentioned?
Yes.
We think it does have to do with the NCJ-FCJ grant that you spoke about.
And in fact, yes, the person who asked the question just said yes.
Okay. Yeah, that grant is for any juvenile drug court in the U.S. So you don't have to be part of anything, belong to any group. If you have a juvenile drug court, you will be able to avail yourself of the services through that grant once it really becomes operational, which should be a little bit later in the spring. And if you want to find more information out about how you can do that and how to become part of it or get some training, hopefully they'll reach out to you. There's a survey going out, I think, in 2 weeks to every juvenile drug court they could identify to get information. But if you happen to be left off that list, I would go to the National Council of Family and Juvenile Court Judges website and send the question in there, or take a look at the site and find how to get those services. And as a last resort, I can also help you get to them.
Great, thank you. We do have one more question, and it is asking if you can please comment on the Scared Straight program that you mentioned that had little or no effect.
Yeah, they've been studied repeatedly with the same results. Basically, they have little or no effect. Often they have a negative effect, actually. Trying to scare a youth into being better typically doesn't work. What most people have found is that some mix of looking at stages of change and incorporating motivational interviewing with youth gets you a lot further than if you're trying to scare them into better behavior. So they don't get scared into better behavior, they get scared into doing the same thing or actually doing worse. The same thing happened with the DARE program. We're getting to prevention here, but DARE, there were lots of questions about it. The Robert Johnson Foundation funded it for something like $10 million to redo the entire program, to make it more effective. It was then placed in several hundred schools, I believe. The evaluation was done, and basically the new DARE program. Now you can go to the National Registry of Effective Programs and Practices at SAMHSA and find programs that are effective, both in prevention and treatment. You'll find those programs that are listed up there. All of them are part of the MREP registry. If you're in a particular state that has their own, that would be Hawaii, Oregon, the state of Washington, and a few others are developing them now. They have their own registries. I know California Child Protective Services or Child Welfare has a registry also of programs and rates them and gives you information about them and their outcomes.
Great, thank you. We do have a follow-up question in relation to Scared Straight. Is it typically designed for first-time offenders?
Scared Straight typically has been delivered either to first-time offenders or youth at risk. I have actually seen it more delivered to youth at risk as opposed to youth who have offended and then they're taking them through that program. The very worst outcomes I've seen are taking youth who aren't even at risk as a universal prevention program and running them through some Scared Straight program and taking them into a jail. And that tends to have the worst outcomes.
Okay, that is the end of our questions. Is there anything else you'd like to comment on, Randy, before we go?
No, at this point, no. I'd just like to thank everybody for hanging in there. I see on the attendee list most people stuck around, which is nice to see. So hopefully you can use this information, and feel free to be in touch.
Thanks. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Please complete the evaluation for today's webinar, and we look forward to having you join the rest of our series. Our third webinar is on February 21st, the Affordable Care Act and Implications for Families Affected by Substance Use Disorders in the Child Welfare System, presented by Suzanne Fields, a senior consultant at the Technical Assistance Collaborative. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.